In the first two videos of this series, I presented Stephen Perry's description of Dworkin's association theory of political obligation and then Perry's criticism of Dworkin. But Perry believes that Dworkin's theory can be saved, and more important, saved by using and applying ideas that come from Dworkin himself. So let me take a few minutes to review what's come before. Dworkin is attempting to provide an account of political obligation, which is the general obligation to obey the law. I've been using the example of a city council putting up a stop sign on the corner of First and Main. The notion of political obligation asks how people can now have an obligation to stop when they come to the corner of First and Main, even if there's no traffic and they can be certain that they'll not be caught. Dworkin argued that the question of the obligation to obey the law goes hand in hand with the question of the government's authority to enforce that law. The government's legitimate authority to impose fines on those who fail to stop on the corner of First and Main requires that it can create an obligation to stop on that corner. Similarly, the government's legitimate authority to throw you in jail if you don't pay your taxes requires that it has the authority to create an obligation to pay those taxes. Dworkin then explains this relationship by arguing that political associations are like other associations that create obligations. He refers particularly to the associations of friendship and family. It's important that the type of obligation we're talking about is not one built on consent, like joining a club. Instead, it's an association one finds oneself in, but which still carries obligations. The obligations that are a part of friendship are literally just that. You wouldn't have a friendship if your relationship didn't include these obligations. A friend isn't somebody that's merely useful as a tool for getting other things that one values. One values the friend themselves. Similarly, the obligations that are a part of political associations are integral to political associations. It's what makes it a political association, and in this case, it includes the obligation to obey the law. However, Perry argued that Dworkin failed to show that political associations are the type of association that comes with obligations. For one thing, associations of family and friendship include personal bonds to others that we don't seem to find in political associations, and the obligations of friendship and family may strongly depend on these bonds. Furthermore, Dworkin argued that the relevant associations that create obligations requires a type of equal concern. But we don't find equal concern among friends. Some friends are closer than others, which corresponds with stronger obligations. Within a family, children have an obligation to obey the parents, but parents have no similar obligation to obey the children. And families don't treat all members equally. Families tend to prioritize the well-being of children above those of any other member. So Stephen Perry is going to try to fix Dworkin's association theory. Importantly, Perry is going to try to use ideas that are borrowed from Dworkin, so in a sense, this will still be Dworkin's theory. So here then is Perry's account of the associative obligations of friendship. Quote, taking friendship as a paradigm, the suggestion is that we can identify a distinctive type of obligation that arises because it is partly constitutive of some form of limited human relationship that possesses intrinsic value. End quote. So what Perry is saying is that friendship has intrinsic value. And the obligations of friendship are a part of friendship. They are integral to friendship. Therefore, the obligations of friendship have value. Technically, in value theory, some theorists would call this type of value participatory value. The value of, for example, a 1-inch square of the Mona Lisa painting is value that it has in virtue of the fact that it participates in the painting itself, and the painting has value. The value of the obligations of friendship is because these obligations participate in friendship, and friendship has intrinsic value. So now we continue with the analogy. The argument that Perry would want to defend for political obligation would then say, first, belonging to a political community has intrinsic value. Second, the political obligations, including the obligation to obey the law, are an integral part of political community. And third, therefore, political obligations, including the obligation to obey the law, has participatory value. A key premise in Perry's argument is the thesis that political associations have intrinsic value, just as friendships have intrinsic value. They are a part of a better quality of life, but not a part in the sense of being instrumentally useful as means to end. Lives that include associations of friendship and political community are simply better lives than the lives in which these are absent. Let's look at the idea of the intrinsic value of friendship. Imagine somebody saying to their friend or their lover or spouse, I value you, but only because you're useful in obtaining other things that I value. I mean, as far as you personally, well, if you cease to be useful, then you are nothing to me. I'll cast you aside for somebody who is more useful. This person actually doesn't have any friends. They're pretty much alone in the world. Whereas a life with genuine friendships is intrinsically better than a life that involves treating others as mere tools, useful for getting other things that one wants. Friendships have intrinsic value, not just instrumental value. And a part of Perry's argument is that political associations also have this type of intrinsic value and not just instrumental value. Now, one can see the community around oneself as a mere tool, something you can use to get what you want, the way that our friendless person sees other people merely as tools. Or you can be a part of the community, a member of the community. The idea is that a life as a part of a community is intrinsically better than a life in which one just uses the community as a means to getting what one wants. There says, quote, the claim must therefore be, I think, that political community is a unique good and one which is necessary for individuals to live complete lives or to be completely fulfilled as human or rational beings, end quote. And these intrinsically valuable relationships come with obligations. Your relationship with your friends, lover, spouse, family means that you are obligated to treat them in certain ways. Merely keeping them around while they're useful and discarding them when they cease to be useful isn't friendship. Similarly, being a member of a political community means that you are obligated to behave in certain ways towards your community. Merely using the community for your own benefit and ignoring anything that isn't a convenience for you isn't a part of being a member of the community. Now, these relationships with your friends also implies that they have obligations to you. If they abuse that relationship, then the relationship comes to an end and the obligation ceases. On Perry's account, your relationship with the community means that you have certain obligations with respect to the community, such as obeying the laws in this case. But it also means that your community has certain obligations towards you to be as concerned with your welfare as with anybody else's in the community. Your community can't legitimately use you and discard you once you cease to be convenient for them. Remember, legitimate government authority is the authority to make laws that people have an obligation to obey, and there's no obligation to obey a law that merely uses you as a benefit for others. At this point, where we start to talk about the community's obligations to its members, the obligations that accompany the members' obligation to obey the law, Dworkin introduces the concept of the law as integrity. Perry says of integrity, quote, it is only genuine political community that can play this role, and that is where integrity comes in. The basic idea, which again has much intuitive appeal, would appear to be something like this. Integrity in law is understood as follows. Now, quoting Perry, who in turn in part quotes Dworkin, integrity, we are told, requires government to speak with one voice, to act in a principled and coherent manner towards all its citizens, to extend to everyone the substantive standards of justice or fairness it uses for some. Integrity is a complex idea which contains a number of different strands. The core idea, however, is easily enough discerned. The state, acting through its various institutions and officials, must always strive to ensure that both its laws and the actions it takes to enforce those laws express a single and comprehensive vision of justice. So what we have is the thesis that a political association with a state that treats the people in accordance with the principle of integrity is intrinsically valuable. Intrinsically valuable relationships come with obligations, and the obligation associated with a political community is the obligation to obey the law. The obligation to obey the law of a state that treats one with integrity is intrinsically valuable. So now, are there any objections with Perry's attempt to improve upon Dworkin's thesis that the obligation to obey the law can be grounded on the intrinsic value of political associations? Now, Perry is presenting what he takes to be the strongest interpretation of Dworkin's theory, but he sees that it may be vulnerable to attack in some areas. Perry asserts that the thesis, quote, depends on a number of strong assumptions. One is the claim that the concept of equal concern has independent moral content. Another is the claim that political community can have intrinsic value. And yet another is the claim that political community is a unique good, which is necessary for human beings to live complete or completely fulfilled lives. Any of these assumptions might be wrong, end quote. Even if all of these assumptions are true, it seems that we may have another objection. It appears as if we're talking about what may be conceived of as the ultimate stalker situation. A state says, you will enter into this relationship with me. You don't have a choice. I promise to love you and care for you and respect you, but you have no option. You can't refuse the relationship. And indeed, we must remember that according to the argument as presented, we would be talking about a stalker that will, in fact, protect and help the stalking victim, but the victim still has no choice about the relationship. The victim is forced into the relationship. What I've sought to present here is how Perry seeks to repair Dworkin's theory of political obligation through political association. Political associations are intrinsically valuable relationships. Intrinsically valuable relationships come with obligations. And the obligation that comes along with the political association is an obligation of obedience to the law. But it's not an obligation to obey the law no matter how abusive or demeaning the law may be. It's an obligation to obey laws that express integrity, that is consistent with the equal concern for all citizens.